were. Well, then I got invited to James Lindsay and Clay Rutledge and myself. We got invited to MythCon in Milwaukee, the Mythicist Milwaukee. And my original idea was, okay, we can't say debate because nobody at PSU, the whole idea of debate isn't going to go. But now I want to debate. I want to debate these folks. I want to debate the legitimacy of certain methods of knowledge production within these fields. So I knew I was going to be on this show. So I called the organizer to confirm what he told me, and I have confirmation of it. And I can send you that, or you can call him yourself if this is what I'm going to say is rather unbelievable, which it is unbelievable until you know why it's unbelievable. They told me they spent 80 hours. 6 people spent 80 hours, 80, emailing and contacting and trying to find a single professor of gender studies in the United States who would come on stage to debate us.
And they couldn't.
Let that sink in.
Wow. So what
let that sink in. Could you imagine any other field if you did that? Physics, math. You don't even need the hard sciences. Psychology. So within these disciplines, they don't value the tradition from Socrates to Habermas. They don't value discourse. They don't value dialogue. They are naked activists, and it's on their webpage repeatedly, and I can send you something for your audience. Just Google gender studies and various departments, and they're activists. They don't want dialogue. They don't want to talk. They are religious fundamentalists, and that they're absolutely convinced that they have the truth, so they don't seek it. So that's the difference between traditional religions. So Christianity has 1 Peter 3:15, give a reason for defense of your faith. These folks, they don't have that. That's absent in their epistemological milieu. They don't have that. And so that's why there can never be a William Lane Craig that emerges in these fields. There can never be a great defender of intersectionality because at the core of their belief system, dialogue and discourse and debate are not involved. So I don't know from that perspective if the idea is ultimately sustainable. But what happens is they've come to institutionalize these ideas that are either or under evidence, and we're seeing the fruits of that now within the academy. We're seeing it within the tech sector. We're seeing it manifest in virtually every area of society. It's really like anyway, I've spoken enough.
Yeah. So then when you earlier said that you don't have you're not optimistic that they could reform themselves, the whole segment that you just spoke exactly speaks to that, which basically says there is no built-in mechanism. I mean, their epistemology, if we can call it that, is anti anything resembling the scientific method that allows us to decide which are the good ideas that we should keep, which are the provisional ideas that we should look at further, which are the ones that we should discard. All of that ultimately is part of, the rape culture and white male science and so on. And so it is impossible to use the autocorrective mechanisms of science to try to shed light on those fields. So if that's true, if we both concede that point, so then what's next? Is it that at some point you go through sort of the Thomas Kuhn, scientific revolutions, not that they are scientific disciplines in of themselves, and eventually the folks who are promulgating this garbage will die out, and that's how you get rid of it? I mean, what's the end game here for these fields?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know what more can be done to... I don't know.
I mean, my feeling is that you had hoped, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that doing the quote SoCal 2.0 that you guys did, right? You're taking, instead of doing one paper, you're taking 20 such papers, that would be such a nuclear bomb that it will be sort of the ultimate, mic drop, and then the fields just collapse. Was that your original hope? And if since it doesn't look like that might materialize, are you disappointed, or do you think that you were just step one of an eventual process of annihilation where these guys will die out?
Yeah, I'm not good at prognosticating. I don't know. I'm not a predictor about that. I don't... Look, the whole idea isn't to collapse these fields because we need these fields. but we need them to be doing rigorous scholarship in a scientific tradition, which they're not. And the fact that there has been, if you'll excuse my vulgarity, failed to be a come to Jesus moment with these folks. The fact that there's been a doubling down and saying that the three of us are alt-right or right-wing people is so utterly preposterous. I mean, I said on my first Rubin interview, which is totally true, I've never, way before this happened, I've never voted for a Republican presidential candidate in my life. And to say that, I've been straight Democrat, and to say that somehow this is a all right-wing conspiracy, we're somehow kind of associated with some fringe religion. It's look, here's a more honest thing to say. We need to take a look at the methods we use to evaluate scholarship in these fields. And these guys, these people, they pointed out something legitimate. And if we really do want to help the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the marginalized, then we need to do so using the best tools and methods we have available. And there have been excesses, and we haven't done that, and now we need to take a look at ourselves in the mirror. Right. That would be, I mean, could you imagine if you did this with physicists or anybody else? They would be thanking you. Right. That's because they're not ideologically driven. They're not, the whole field, these fields are dominated by people who are ideologues. I mean, and really, you need to take a look at why that's a kind of religious way or a religious approach to the problem. So no, I don't want to utterly although now I'm having I'm now rethinking this because I don't know if these fields can reform themselves. I think that they're tenured professors. They have too much to gain. They have too much. They've institutionalized themselves. It's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, so as you may know, I'm working on my next book that looks at idea pathogens, and a lot of the fields that you talk about, I consider them to be manifestations of these, parasites, these mind parasites. One of the things that I talk about, I actually worked on that section maybe about a week ago. I drew an analogy between the field of operations research. Let me, if you allow me to just give a bit of an explanation. So I come from myself, just like Jim, from a math background. And one of the fields that I studied and wrote even a mini thesis in my undergrad, and then a slightly bigger mini thesis as part of my MBA on a topic called the two-dimensional cutting stock problem. And again, bear with me. The two-dimensional cutting stock problem is when you have, say, sheets of metal or sheets of wood or of glass, and then you're trying to, someone gives you an order. I'd like to have 10 rectangles of X by Y and 20 squares of X by X. How do you cut these larger sheets so that you minimize the amount of wasted raw material? This is part of a field called operations research because it tries to either maximize or minimize something, okay? And so I use that as an analogy for then the universities, where I argue that historically the objective function that you were trying to maximize was the pursuit of truth. Right? That was the function that you were trying to optimize, to find an optimal for. Okay. Today, what you're trying to maximize or minimize, for example, you're trying to minimize hurt feelings. And it turns out that these opposing objective functions cannot coexist, right? You either pursue truth or you try to minimize hurt feelings. You see what I'm saying? And so go ahead.
Well, that should be the most obvious thing. Anytime you introduce an exogenous characteristic into a meritocratic system, by definition, you have to take away from the objective, the original objective. It's like that's why we don't look at racial hiring among NBA basketball players, right? Because we have a singular focus, and that's to win the game. And anytime some other exogenous variable comes in, you decrease the likelihood of a win. Well, the same thing is true in the pursuit of truth. It's identical.
Exactly. And actually, it's funny that you're saying about the NBA and so on, because I've remarked that, for example, if you look at the Boston Marathon winners, let me summarize for you who they are. Yeah. Kenya, Ethiopia, Kenya, right? If we look at the top 25 NFL rushers of all time, 24 out of the 25 are black. One is white. Do you know, by the way, who it is?
I know literally nothing about sports.
Well, if any of the folks who are listening to this know who it is, write it in the comments section. He's a player who was big maybe in the 70s. He played for the Washington Redskins, but in any case, there's only one white guy on that list. But of course, we know now that in academia, the place where it should, by definition, be driven by a meritocracy of ideas and so on, it's now all based on equity, inclusiveness, and diversity, right? The most prestigious chairs that are awarded at our university, let alone by our Canadian government, are now awarded not so much based on the weight of your CV, but on all sorts of other identity politics metrics. So it's an utter disaster. It is.
Right.
So it's go ahead.
So I would argue this. So by definition, we've already agreed, and people can disagree in the comments, what have you, that every time you introduce another variable, you have to take away from what your objective is. There's just no other way. It couldn't be. It's almost that way by definition. So there are two things that you said. The first is about the, Kenya, and the running. So there's a paper in that. So if you're a gender scholar and you look at that, and you already start from the premise of biology denialism, the paper that you want to conclude is there's something in Kenyan culture that is responsible for these individuals, even if they're raised in backgrounds, different adoption. That's the way that we determine everything, or determine the many biological bases of belief. Pinker writes about this with the Maliford twins, etc. We look at identical twins weird at birth. So if you're writing a gender studies paper about that, you just basically construct the idea that it's culture, you situate it in the literature, boom, there's your paper. So you can maintain your biology denialism. But the second thing is, if we want to do that with our university system, and I personally don't think we should, but if we want to do that, then let's be honest about it. That we should be honest about it, right? We should say, you know what? The pursuit of truth is no longer a principal objective. It is an objective along with a suite of other objectives, and among those is that we get diverse candidates. And we need to be further honest about that and say what we mean by diversity. We mean diverse in the most superficial way possible. Trivial skin color, trivial sexual orientation. We certainly do not mean ideological or intellectual diversity. So let's be honest in our universities what we're doing. Because every time we're not being honest about it, they're seen from the outside not only as being dishonest, but as being a farce. And they undermine total confidence in the institution, the meritocracy of the institution, and ultimately that is not sustainable.
Right.
So if you want to play this game where you're looking for superficial characteristics and then you're shoehorning people in, look, you can have any kind of university you want, but you should be at least honest about what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I hear you.